Okay. Hi, hello everyone. Welcome to FLAD. It is a pleasure to have you here. My name is Rita Faden and I'm FLAD's president. FLAD is the Portuguese-American Development Foundation or Luso-American Development Foundation. For those of you who haven't joined us here before, we are a Portuguese private foundation and our mission is to contribute to the Portuguese development through the relationship with the United States of America. And we are, Portugal and the United States, as you know, both founding members of NATO. We are here today to commemorate the 75th anniversary of NATO, and we are very happy to be with so many friends in the room for this momentous occasion. Transatlantic cooperation in matters of security and defense was crucial to FLAD's existence in the first place and has been at the center of our activity for the past 39 years. It is a pleasure to welcome you all here as we partner with the Portuguese Atlantic Treaty Association and the Young Atlantic Treaty Association to celebrate the 75th anniversary of this enduring alliance and of the Transatlantic Committee to Collective Defense. I would like to welcome and thank the presidents of these institutions, João Rebelo and Francisco Nobre, for their good cooperation and their enthusiasm in organizing with us this event. 75 years ago, in the aftermath of World War II, representatives from 12 countries came together in Washington to sign the North Atlantic Treaty, through which they committed to defend each other and to preserve peace in the Euro-Atlantic area. NATO expanded at the end of the Cold War and has reaffirmed itself as the backbone of the Euro-Atlantic security. In 2019, we hosted a conference here at FLAD to celebrate the 70th anniversary of NATO. This was only 5 years ago, and back then, we all stressed the resilience of NATO after the dismantling of the Soviet Union, and the discussion partly focused on explaining why NATO was still vital to our security. The discussion back then was we felt that we had to justify why NATO was still so crucial and so important. And the reality is that NATO was crucial then as it is today. But now, we have an increasing aggressive common threat that has resurfaced and brought war back to Europe. In this context, the indispensable role of NATO to the security of each of our countries has become even more clear. And in this crisis, the Atlantic Alliance appeared before the world more united than it had been for the last decades. A stronger, larger NATO is one of the unintended consequences of Putin's invasion, as NATO member states showed a clear support for Ukraine and 2 new member states joined the alliance. I'm very happy to have here with us the Finnish ambassador, and I would like also to have the Swedish ambassador, and I hope that will be here with us in a new occasion. Welcome. It's a great, I think it's a joy for all of us to have been able to welcome 2 new countries to NATO. Thank you. This weekend, the US House of Representatives approved a $60 billion aid package to Ukraine to support its defense against Russia. And early this year, EU leaders also approved a €50 billion aid package until 2027. But both instances show us that we cannot take this commitment for granted. And we see challenges emerging both from the outside and from inside the societies of our member states. And that is why we are here today. We invite you all to celebrate the founding moment of this alliance, because we are convinced that the legacy of what brought these countries together in 1949 must be actively preserved, both by decision makers and within the societies at large. And at FLAD, we believe we have a role to play in this. We are thankful for our speakers who will help us think critically about how NATO can be better prepared to answer to current international challenges. Joining us today is General José Nunes da Fonseca, the Chief of the General Staff of the Portuguese Armed Forces, who will deliver opening remarks. It is an honor to welcome you here. Thank you for accepting our invitation. His remarks will be followed by a panel with Major General Nuno Lemos Pires, the National Defence Policy Director, and Professor Ana Santos Pintos, Executive Director of the Portuguese Institute of International Relations, IPRI, who was appointed by NATO Secretary-General, head of the group of experts tasked with reviewing NATO's approach to its southern neighborhood. The panel will be moderated by Francisco Nobre. We will then open for questions from the audience, and we will invite you, all of you, to participate in what I'm certain will be a lively and interesting discussion. Thank you all. João.
Hello. Thank you very much, Rita, for the opening of this, your remarks on the opening of this conference that FLAD and the Portuguese Athletic Committee is organizing. A small explanation, because most of you know the work that the Portuguese Athletic Committee is doing, but we have some ambassadors here, so I will explain. The Portuguese Athletic Committee is a non-governmental organization that works for the Ministry of Defense and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Portugal, and is a member of the Atlantic Treaty Association. As you may know, when NATO was created in 1949, it has the political wing, the military wing, but also it was very new at that time, a citizenship wing. And the Atlantic Treaty Association was created for that reason, to explain, to debate, and to project the values of NATO in the societies of the countries member of NATO. Now that we are 32 countries, the work, as you may understand, is quite very important. I want to acknowledge the presence of TOS of General Nunes Fonseca, that is the General Chief of Staff of the Portuguese Armed Forces. It's not the first time that you are with the Portuguese Athletic Committee. We've been working together when you were Chief of the Army and now with the General Staff of the Armed Forces. Thank you very much once again to be present. Your remarks last year with 50 young people from all NATO countries that were visiting Portugal, and we organized that seminar, were remarks that everyone enjoyed very much. It was very important to explain the work of the Portuguese Armed Forces in NATO, for NATO, on the collective security. And now is, of course, our two panel, Ana Santos Silva, that you will be presenting her Santos Pinto, that will present her remarks also, and General Lemos Pires. I've been very fortunate to work with you when I was a member of Parliament and you were a Secretary of State for Defense. And I think even if I were in the opposition, we were doing a great job because, of course, NATO and EU was something that linked together socialists and Christian Democrats in the Parliament at that time. Before entering on the debate and the remarks of our keynote speaker, I'd like to challenge our two debaters and maybe also General with some approach, some ideas. I like to use the phrase that Churchill said once: security is not everything, but everything is nothing without security, which is very true. I can say beautiful things about NATO right now, which all of them are true. We are all the time reaffirming shared values of individual liberty, human rights, democracy, the rule of law. It's true. Even if war continues in Ukraine, the transatlantic bond, unity, cohesion, and solidarity at a critical time for security is stronger than ever. It's true. NATO is growing in this membership, in its capacities and readiness. It's true. We have Sweden and Finland now, and I compliment you, Mr. Ambassador, for Finland to be here. We are very happy to have two new countries in NATO. Collective security, in accordance with Article 5, is ironclad commitment. It's very true. Collective defense from all threats based on the 360 degrees approach, which one of the panel is doing her work right now in NATO, to fulfill NATO three core tasks: deterrence and defense, crisis prevention and management, and cooperative security based in the open door policy of the Article 10. It's very true, still happening. But then we have some major issues that are threatening our work in NATO and all those goals. We are in a world of chaos and war, violence, insecurity, natural disaster, climate emergency. It's true also. Russia is our most direct and significant threats, like the new strategical concept of NATO approach. It's true. Each day we are facing that threats, not only in Ukraine, and I compliment the ambassador of Ukraine that she's present also, and our total support for your country on this war against Russia. But Russia is not only attacking Ukraine; they are attacking every day all members of NATO country member. We have to face that. China ambition and coercive policies challenge NATO interests, security, and values. It's very true also. And finally, we are confronted by cyber, space, hybrid, asymmetric threats, and by malicious use of new technology each day that we are facing. And finally, where are the commitment of 2% of the GDP on investment on defense, on the budget? We had a huge improvement in the last 3-4 years, it's true, but not all the countries are doing that. Not our country is not doing that, and we need to push forward this goal. It's fundamental that all the country fulfill with that goal, and not only 2% of the budget for the GDP, but also 20% of the investment. That 2% of the GDP, 20% must be investment in equipment, research and development. And finally, what about the US election on November? One of the main candidates have an approach against NATO very aggressive. I think all our members that will discuss this issue should approach maybe this problem. What about the European Parliament election? The growing of extreme right parties that are anti-NATO. It will be a problem also that we have to face. The polls are very disturbing in a lot of countries. And what about some of the NATO members and their rogue, they are acting like a rogue country toward NATO. Hungary, Slovakia, we have election in Croatia. What about the president of Turkey receiving the leader of Hamas? So we are seeing a lot of phenomena and problems that can undermine the unity and the work of NATO. So I show you the good sides of what NATO is doing and doing very well, and of course all the challenges that we have. Of course, we have a lot of more challenge ahead, of course. But NATO still is the most successful military alliance ever. And like Rita Faden said, when we are debating in the end of the Cold War if we need NATO again, well, we really need that NATO keep doing this job because we feel more protected and we need that. So now I will present our keynote speaker for the first panel that we have. General Nunes da Fonseca is, as you know, the Chief of the General Staff of the Portuguese Armed Forces. He enters in the military academy in 1979. He holds a degree in military science engineering and master degree in military engineering from the military academy. Throughout his career, he served in various units in the army and the armed forces. In the 1st Engineer Regiment, he was the company commander. In the army staff, he served as advisor in the logistical division. And in the cabinet of the chief of staff of the army, he was advisor for general affairs and advisor to the chief of the staff of the army. Aboard, he served as in Eurofor in Italy as an officer in operation and logistics section and head of the operational procedure section of the operation division. As Brigadier General, he was Director of Joint Logistics Support Group at the NATO Allied Force Command in Spain, in Madrid. He carried out 2 tours of duty in NATO operation, the first in the S4 NATO Stabilization Force in Bosnia-Herzegovina, as operation officer in the headquarters of the multinational Southeast Division. The second in the K4 NATO force in Kosovo, as the general commander of the logistical force of this operation. In October 2018, he was appointed Chief of Staff of the Army, a position he held until his appointment as Chief of the General Staff of the Portuguese Armed Forces in March last year. Thank you very much, General. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Your Excellencies, Mr. President of the Portuguese Atlantic Committee, Madam President of the Administrative Council of the Luso-American Development Foundation, Mr. President of YATA Portugal, distinguished ambassadors and high representatives, distinguished members of this panel, Professor Ana Santos Pinto and Major General Lemos Pires, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Please accept my sincere greetings and appreciation for giving me the opportunity to present, on behalf of the Portuguese Armed Forces, our vision and contributions to NATO on occasion of its remarkable anniversary. 75 years ago, the world witnessed the establishment of a political and military alliance among several countries of Western Europe, the United States of America, and Canada. One of the primary objectives of this alliance was to ensure the collective defense of the constituent countries. In the case of an attack on a member country, all the other members would come to help it, defending or restoring its integrity. The alliance established a kind of a physical barrier with a group of predominant Atlantic countries standing between the maritime power and the land power. Initially integrating 12 countries, among which Portugal, the alliance progressively allowed the accession of other countries, having currently 32 members. A fact is that the last enlargements of the alliance mainly included Eastern European countries, and subsequently other perspectives had to be envisaged with related new challenges. NATO unquestionably merits recognition as the most successful military organization ever created. In its 75 years life, was able to assure peace to its member countries. Curiously, only once the Article 5 had been invoked, the one that establishes the already mentioned obligation of mutual assistance in the event of an attack on one of the countries. It happened after the terrorist attacks inside the United States of America on September 11, 2001. Moments of tension also tested the nature and the existence of the alliance, almost blanking over its inspiring ideals of democracy, peace, and freedom. Examples include the Suez Crisis in 1956, France's withdrawal from the alliance military structure in 1966, discussions on nuclear weapons, the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, more recently, Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, following the annexation of Crimea 8 years before. Throughout its history, NATO has adapted its strategy, assuming a broader posture, including political military engagement beyond allied territories, never neglecting the enduring objective that originated its creation, the collective defense of its members. Being categorical that the international arena is heavily marked by the war in Ukraine, the recent accessions of Finland, I salute the Madam Finnish Ambassador, last year, and of Sweden past March 11, is a clear sign of NATO's relevance and of the confidence it gives to its members. And we may furthermore say to the rest of the world, democratic countries. So NATO has been reaffirming its relevance based on an enduring focus on its values, credible deterrence, consolidated solidarity and cohesion, and continuous flexibility to adapt and to transform. To summarize, the alliance is bigger, stronger, determined, and proactive. In the case of Portugal, NATO has provided, since its inception, a transformative and driving energy for the Portuguese military instrument. The benefit of the transatlantic presence contributed to modernize resources, to shape organizational culture, to generate knowledge, to value personnel, and to renovate structures. The Portuguese military forces became noteworthy actors in terms of participating steadily, exchanging experiences, and sharing knowledge with their alliance partners. In fact, from the creation of NATO, Portugal has been involved in alliance's activities, missions, and operations. The first presence in a NATO exercise must be highlighted. It happened in 1950 with 3 naval vessels. Portuguese troops were also engaged in some of NATO's major military interventions, such as Operations I-4 and S-4 in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and the ISAF and the Resolute Support Mission in Afghanistan. For this year, 2024, the Portuguese Armed Forces plan to carry out 34 missions involving capabilities from the 3 services, 12 of which within the framework of NATO. Over 900 military personnel, 3 ships, 7 aircraft, and 59 tactical vehicles will be engaged. As of today, Portugal has around 1,000 military personnel deployed to international missions, actively contributing to global security and peace. 635 of whom within the scope of NATO, notably in Romania and in Lithuania, and in the north, in the Mediterranean, and in the Baltic Seas. As mentioned, the progressive expansion of NATO has brought new challenges that implied the update of threat perceptions. In this context, the Portuguese Armed Forces increased its presence in the eastern border of the alliance, showing cohesion and solidarity with the countries involved. This participation, whether through exercises or operations, allows for increased improvements in effectiveness and interoperability, demonstrating a strong alignment and common purposes. To summarize, Portuguese military and civilian personnel, constituted forces and assets, have always shown courage, professionalism, and resilience, garnering the respect of allies and partners alike. Portugal's contribution to NATO missions and exercises show its profound commitment to upholding international peace and security. NATO's current strategic concept, approved at the Madrid summit in 2022, reaffirms the alliance's fundamental objective of ensuring the collective defense of its members. It establishes the core tasks of deterrence and defense, crisis prevention and management, and cooperative security, and advocates for a 360-degree approach. To face global and interconnected threats encompassing transnational terrorist threats, geopolitical rivalries, instability in the southern flank, malicious activities in cyberspace and space, emergency of disruptive technologies, and the erosion of the rules-based international order. The international community is undergoing a tumultuous period marked by volatility and polarization. This situation has somehow originated doubts on the nature and validity of NATO. The alliance answered in accordance, adapting to changes, remaining increasingly credible, cohesive, responsive, and agile, and continuously ready to deal with the defense and security concerns of the allies. According to its 360-degree approach, NATO is strengthening the connection between the armed forces and the citizens, continuing on the path of adapting deterrence and improving readiness and interoperability with all its members. The Portuguese armed forces, with realism and credibility, will continue to honor their commitment to NATO, developing their individual capability and contributing to collective capabilities. As the senior Portuguese operational commander in charge, I am truly proud of our troops' achievements when engaged on behalf of NATO in the last 75 years. The Portuguese Armed Forces will be striving to do their best, strongly committed to NATO's activities, missions, and operations, addressing current and emerging threats in all operational domains, whether at sea, on land, in the air, in space, or in cyberspace, in the pursuit of a safer world on behalf of Portugal. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon to all. First of all, I'd like to thank General Nunes da Fonseca for the opening remarks for this event. And I would like to thank you all for your presence to highlight the importance of having military personnel, ambassadors in Portugal, to have politicians, academics, to have young people, and to have civil society overall to engage in a discussion such as this one that's so important for all of us in our daily lives, and especially since the Russian invasion against Ukraine, we have noticed how important NATO is to safeguard and to support the security of Europe, but within the transatlantic space as a whole. Well, and of course I must thank the Portuguese Atlantic Committee and FLAD for the cooperation in organizing this event, because to have two organizations opened to the idea of having a youth association take part in the organization of an event such as this one, in regards to relevancy and to importance, it's of high regard, and on behalf of my team, I would like to thank you both. The introductions have been made, and we'll have a discussion on NATO at 75, challenges ahead, and I would very much start with a very simple and direct question, which, after João Rebelo has already introduced some of the challenges there are to come in the upcoming years for NATO and for the allies. And I would start by asking our speakers, which challenges would you highlight as the most relevant for the upcoming years? And we could start with Major General Lemos Pires.
Thank you so much for the question. It's not easy to find what is the best or the worst challenge that we're going to face. And I say best and worst in purpose, because at this moment we have an opportunity that is bigger than ever. We are 32 very determined countries that really want to defend itself, and of course an attack against one, it's an attack against all of them. So this is a strength, this is a show of strength after 75 years, this is of a huge value. But that said, the invasion of Ukraine, the aggression of Ukraine, is something that we cannot allow ourselves to lose. And it's we that we are losing, because they are fighting our war. The people, the citizens of Ukraine are fighting the war for all of us, because if we cannot stand this challenge, we will be facing a lot of challenges in the future. In the end, it's all about the resilience of Ukraine. It's all about what they can do and what they can do for itself. But we, just because we don't let them go, it reminds ourselves, especially reminding me as a Portuguese citizen, that I also am here talking today in English, but talking Portuguese because I had the help of many allies and friends throughout my history. We had a lot of people telling us during the 14th century and 17th century, hey, come on, don't care about that, why don't you just align with those guys and don't fight them, you can be close together, why don't you be part of that nation or that other organization? But we prevailed because we had friends. We prevailed because in the very, very different situation for 24 years during the Wars of Restauration, or during, of course, the French invasions and other parts of our history, we prevailed because we had allies that trusted us and we did our job. So as the Ukrainians are doing their job. So as long as we prevail and we stay determined, we can go ahead. So right now, this is a time of resilience. So if I can say my challenge is like this, we are in 1941. In 1941, if everyone remembers well, in 1941, we were facing a moment, a challenge in Europe, where everybody, all the newspapers, and we have here people from Diário de Notícias, if you can read those newspapers from that time, they're talking about, well, Germany already has the control of half of France. Austria, of course, is part of Germany. Germany already occupied Holland. Why don't we? Let's care about if the Germans are crazy enough to attack Russia or not. That was the issue. Second issue was the Americans will help the British or not. That was the issue that you can read on the newspapers in the beginning of 1941. Like a big majority of chunk of population in the world was believing that Germany already won the war, and some of the nations were still striving to keep out of them, and that was the scenario. So much different in 1944, 1945. But we forget that part. We try to forget that we lived in one time in 1941, and right now, 2024, we are in 1941. People disbelieve, but we have to believe. We have to stand with de Gaulle. We have to stand with the Dutch resilience. We have to stand by with all of those guys fighting in Italy, in Greece, that believed that there was no time to not prevail. So, I'm being very long, but the biggest challenge we have now is the way that we prevail. The way that we don't just fade away just because we believe that the circumstance is bad and we should give up. This is not time for giving up. This is time to stand together and keep fighting together.
Thank you. Professor.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I would like to start by thanking the invitation to be here today. I will synthesize the challenges in two words, coherence and mindset. Coherence because we can internally in NATO, but also externally, be challenged about our values. Democracy, rule of law, human rights, civil freedoms. And if that are the values that underpin the allies and the alliance, we must be really aware of this coherence between allies. Coherence also in the way that the alliance approaches their core tasks that are already been mentioned here, deterrence, crisis management, and collective security. Because not all allies see core tasks and the way that should be operationalized in the same way. And that when we are talking about NATO, that is a consensus-based institution, that means all decisions are taken by consensus. This is very difficult. What is the approach to deterrence? Where do we identify crises to be managed, and to whom we cooperate relatively to security? And also coherence and cohesion about the threats. Because to be very clear, the strategic concept of 2022 only identified two common threats: Russia and terrorism. The rest is not consensualized between the allies. Relation with China, the question of EU-NATO cooperation, very divisive inside the alliance. If you would like burden sharing or responsibility sharing, not only the question of 2%, but much more than that. Enlargement, to who, in what moment? So, of course, Ukraine is today a central point of the alliance. But we also need to be clear, NATO is not directly involved in Ukraine. The question is, are the allies coherent, sufficiently coherent to be coordinated in a structure in order to be more responsive, more committed with the objectives that Ukraine is fighting for all of us, and this goes to the democracy, rule of law, human rights, and the values that are at base of the alliance. The second, regarding the mindset, is at least so challenging as coherence. We are not in the Cold War. We are not in the 40s or in the 70s. We are in a very different world. We have youth with a very different engagement with the political approach, the military approach. We cannot use the same instruments. It's very difficult to change minds, but change minds means that we look to the world, and I was seeing over there the map that was brought by our Chief of Staff, that shows that the world is very big. NATO is still the golden standard on military operationalization, missions, technology, etc. But NATO also needs to engage outside its echo chambers and also needs to change the mindset regarding East and South, because this is mindset. It is not one or the other. It is not a zero-sum game. And I think these debates, both about coherence and about the mindset, are very difficult to have at the political, military, civil society, parliamentary dimension of the alliance.
Actually, I would pick up a point about the matter of not all threats being seen by all the allies. And of course, you worked with the special expert group on the southern flank, and you even met Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. And I would ask you, for example, it was Portugal who proposed for the southern flank to be included in the summit declaration from Vilnius last year. And I was going to ask you, from my notes, how is the southern flank perceived within the alliance? Because for the southern allies, it's an important point to develop, to study, but maybe for the northern ones, not as much. And so, of course, in this year is going to be approved as well a strategy by, I'm not sure if it's at the Washington summit, but there's going to be a strategy of NATO for the southern flank. And I would actually mix both questions, I would say. First, how to achieve this consensus regarding the southern flank, considering that it's going to be a strategy for it. And at the same time, this original question that I had on how is the southern flank perceived within the alliance, especially because it's a particular important point for our national security and national defense planning.
Well, the southern neighborhoods, as the group named it, because we are talking about very different areas, North Africa, Middle East, Sahel, Sub-Saharan Africa, maritime adjacent areas like the Red Sea, the Mediterranean, of course, are seen, as the strategic concept very clearly states, as an area of threats, mainly in the dimension of the terrorism, but also relating with instability, political instability, the role of Iran. It's a very complex arena. But again, we have very different perceptions about, firstly, what is the South? What the expert group proposed is based on the strategic concept and the existing frameworks, Mediterranean Dialogue and the ICI, the Istanbul Cooperation Initiative for the Mediterranean and for the Gulf, Middle East. Based on that, we added the Sahel, I think that for very clear reasons. And of course, in the case of Sub-Saharan Africa, because of the interrelation between them. And I found it very surprising that for the majority of the allies, was not so clear about the link between the East and the South. When we have Russia presence in North Africa, but mainly on the Sahel, with the Africa Corps, that is the substitute of Wagner. When we have a profound disinformation campaign with the populations, and we made a lot of interviews, not only with government, with military, but also with civil society organizations, and that is coming from the South. And this, of course, we have Iran transferring drones to Russia to be applied in the case of Ukraine. And all this comes from the south. So the perception of the alliance, because it's a defensive alliance, is mostly connected with threats and risks. I will add opportunities. We are, Middle East and Africa, in front of the most youngest societies for the next generations. We have critical material that we need for our daily basis, from internet, communications, computers, cars, digital transition, climate transition, and we need to connect with these regions. We have deeply economic relations. So putting only on the threats and risks, I think it's very limited and passes a very, I will say, negative, that is based by polls, very negative perception of the alliance. I do not know if the Washington Summit will have a strategy for the South. The topic is being debated. There are 3 main priorities for the Washington Summit. That is Ukraine, furthering the Indo-Pacific partnerships, and also go a little bit beyond on cooperative security. So I do not know if there is a strategy. I think that any strategy needs to be based on a political guidance, and the allies and NATO ecosystem, as I would like to call it, need to agree firstly on that, and then propose a strategy.
Thank you. I would also like to ask Major General Lemos Pires, of course, there's a process of identifying a challenge and then approaching it. And this happens at national level and within the alliance as well. And I would like to ask you how this goes, because it's a process, a dual process, that goes hand by hand. So within the Ministry of National Defense, how does the planning, the policy planning go with the alliance?
Okay, let me pick from the last that Anderson Schmidt just talked about the threats that comes to NATO. I call it a belly of wars. If you think of it, it's like a belly. A belly that starts, of course, in the Arctic, goes through Ukraine, Middle East, goes all the way from the Strait of Hormuz to the Gulf of Guinea. This is the belly. So everything is interlinked, from Niger to Mali, to Burkina Faso, to Central African Republic, to Somalia, to Yemen, of course, what we're seeing now in Iran. And everything is really interlinked, because Russia needs Iran, Iran sponsors terrorism in many parts in Africa, Africa benefits from the works of Wagner Group provides from of course, the resources that they need to attack in the other places, and of course the resources they need for the narrative. If we think about the nations that are together with Putin, 4 out of the 6 of them are in this belly of wars. The other 2 is Nicaragua and North Korea. So if you think about it, there is a belly of wars. And you have to have a coherent approach for all of that. So NATO really has to face east, north, west, south. Now, that's why we grow in NATO from 90 degrees during the beginning of NATO to 180 degrees when you go a little bit further, and we went to, of course, the Balkans, and then, of course, Iraq and all of that. And now we're talking always about 360 degrees approach. But we have to have a little bit of more than these approaches, partnerships. So NATO has to think about partnerships. Now you ask me, how do I put together a nation and the alliances that I participate? So we are part of EU, we are part of NATO, we also are part of the CPLP, and we are a UN active, credible member. So what we do is we base our analysis in 2 things, and this is very important. First of all, threats and risks. That's one. And that's what we have to do in the National Defense Minister, is we have to watch out for threats and risks for now, for the next 25 to 50 years. We don't prepare for the next 2. We don't prepare for the next electoral cycle. We prepare for the next generation of threats and risks. That's why we're looking about multi-domain approach, like the chart said, but we're also looking about new threats and risks that will arise from, of course, climate change and things like that. Second thing is, if we have the analysis of threats and risks in this belly of wars, and of course in this whole environment of 360 degrees approach, then we go to the country itself. And we see 2 things: resources allocated to defense, the whole of government approach for the country in resilience, and finally, last but not the least, the determination or the will of the people, because it's all about the will of the people. It's all about what every citizen in the nation wants to do with its own defense. Because in the end, the people who lead the countries depend on the will of the people who are leading for this effort. And that's what we do. So we merge trends, we do narrative, strategic approach, and then we look at all the threats and risks and organize what we call a sequence response for now, for the next year, for the next 2 years, for the next 10 years, strategic concept, and really doing a scope for the next 25 or 50. That's what we try to do at least.
Of course, that you have a wide experience working on the ground in Pakistan, Afghanistan, Angola, and Mozambique, and you actually talked about this matter. There's a belly of conflicts that's coming up, and particularly in neighboring countries of NATO or nearby countries to NATO, and particular conflicts of high relevance, such as it happens in Ukraine. What I would like to ask you is, would you think that within the planning, of course, NATO has the operational and training missions and capacity building missions, would you believe that NATO, considering the current situation in the past 2 years and even this year, that there should be a deeper planning that would involve these sort of missions, a bigger number of them, or bigger variety, or bigger the planning overall? Of course, we cannot prevent these sort of conflicts, but could NATO play a bigger role in helping solving them?
Let me be clear. The time I spent in NATO, 5 years, many people here spend a lot of time as well, we plan for everything, and very well. The problem is not the planning that we have to face for now and for the future, or if you're not facing the 360 degrees approach, in area, out of area, that's what you're asking as well, or the more probable or the less probable. It's about coherence. It's about what Anna just said. If we have 32 countries agreeing on what is the biggest priority, are all of us on board, or putting forward this priority as number one, this as number two, this number, that divides. And that is not always clear. So the strength of NATO is because we are 32 and all of us have to be united in one decision. But of course, that is also the fragility. One country is enough to stop Sweden to come in, just to remind this, for a long time. So sometimes we have to remind these obvious things, is although we plan, and we plan well, I think nations around NATO can be our NATO headquarters, especially in Brussels and of course SHAPE, they do a fantastic job. And there is no links or holes missing. From space to cyberspace to deep seas, submarine cables, everywhere we are looking, everywhere we are planning, and we are transforming NATO. That's why we have one command just for transformation, ACT. So that means that the planning is there. Now, what is the political will? What are we going to discuss? What is going to be the discussions in Washington? What are we looking forward in the future? Are we united in the same fronts? Are we divided in the 360 degrees approach? That is much more a political discussion than planning issues. Because the planning part, it's okay.
Okay, thank you. I actually wanted to address this perhaps further ahead in the conversation, but maybe to bring it out now, as Professor Ana Santos Pinto already touched the matter of the Washington Conference and Major General Lem Spears as well. Would you believe this, because it's 75 years, would you believe this will be a landmark summit in terms of what the alliance, how the alliance will present itself, considering not only what comes behind, but to celebrate the current year and to analyze the current scenario, that it's a changing scenario in the world affairs? Would this be an historical, of course, Professor Ana Santos Pinto is my professor and he's not a big fan of futurology, and I'm not trying to engage in that way. But analyzing what the current scenario is and knowing how the work has been done within the alliance up until today, would this summit be a historical one or a landmark one?
Well, I think that for public relation purposes, all summits are historical for any reason. And this one, with the 75th anniversary of the Alliance, also would be, because it's in Washington, because it's going to be organized in the middle of an electoral campaign in the United States, because there are many allies that are not certain and about the future after 5th of November. But firstly, I think what Washington Summit will transmit publicly will be celebrating what has been achieved until now, that is maintaining the alliance, maintaining the defense of the allies. The second thing is the idea of opening the alliance to the world with the global partnerships, the engagement with the Indo-Pacific, and probably some contributes relating to the South. But we have also a political, international political context that limits a lot this celebration and the way that NATO can be engaged with. I really don't know if we are going to have, normally summits do not achieve anything very concrete. It's not needed to see the future, it's just a pattern of behavior. But I think in this particular moment, the political will, and sometimes what we understood also in this study that we have made, is that inside NATO, meaning ally societies, there is no information or knowledge about what NATO is. People do not know that there are different pillars, military dimension, the international staff with the political military dimension, the allies, each of them, 32 foreign defense policies, etc. And the way that things go and are organized and evolve, majority of people do not know what NATO does. And we always talk about the 2%, but there is many other things to talk about NATO besides the 2% that need informative and a very sometimes pedagogical way of talking about transatlantic relations. And of course, that the public diplomacy is a challenge in current days. I think youth and IATA has a very important role to do. But it's a challenge to organize this summit at this moment of the transatlantic relations because of the major partner, United States, political internal debate. Just for the majority of people to understand, it was the first time in American history, democratic procedure in the Congress, that Republicans and Democrats aligned on a rule procedure to vote because the majority of Republicans could not agree on approving the financing for Ukraine. So looking to internal processes inside each ally, it's very important. As General Lemos just said, it takes one to block, whatever. So this is something that I think normally we do not debate and do not discuss, and probably, of course, it will not be debated in the summit, but the summit will pass celebration, will pass challenges, but certainly very uncertainty about the following months and the way to go.
This was actually the following topic I was thinking of bringing up, which is the US election. Because on a personal view, if I think about the events, expectable events to come for the next 12 months, the one that might affect the most the dynamics of the alliance, under my perspective, off the top of my head, perhaps would be the US election. I don't know what would be your perspective of course, we know that different candidates have different views, but how could this election actually have an effect on the dynamic, on the internal dynamic of the alliance? I'll start by the general.
Well, to look forward, and I can do a little bit of wishful thinking, because I'm not a political analyst, as you know. Usually I wear the uniform, but right now I'm doing a different job. So let me try to do my best. First of all, United States of America is a long-standing democracy. And it has been uninterrupted democracy for the last 2.5 centuries. Never stopped to be a democracy. And if you think about who was the most proactive people in America towards NATO, both Republicans and Democrats, you saw no difference between these two parties in the whole history of the United States supporting the importance of NATO for the last 75 years. So maybe there are discussions about political stances here and there, but I do believe I'm sure, this long-standing democracy will have their own ways of discussing what is going to be the future. So instead of looking at what a political leader is saying right now and another political leader is saying, I like to go deep in that beautiful, huge continent that's called the United States of America, much more than a country, it's a huge continent, and see that, of course, democracy is flowing, and whenever there is a huge problem, they get together and try to solve it in a different way, because that's how democracy works. So I would not make, of course, maybe in Washington, in July, we are going to look a little bit more to the past and what we achieve and what, of course, expectations, and we are strong and we have been for the last 75 years. And of course, we are looking for the elections that are coming, and maybe that will come as a distress, but probably not. Wishful thinking is probably not. I think in the end, as democracy prevails, values prevails, the big goals of what joins us together prevails. Let's see. But maybe it's just wishful thinking.
Professor, would you like to add something?
As a political scientist, I work with patterns of behavior. And this election has quality. We have two candidates that already were presidents. So we know what are the patterns that precede this election. In the case of the Republican candidate being Donald Trump, we are in face of a transactional way of approaching international politics. And we know that the context inside the alliance, based again on consensus and unanimity, can be jeopardized on specific topics. In the case of Democratic candidate being President Joe Biden, we also have this relation with Europe and European allies and the involvement in this approach, and also the question of China that is bipartisan in the case of the United States. So we can have the idea of how it's going to be organized, although I think European allies, and probably Canada too, are in the process of denial. Let's try to think that it could be different. And this is particularly relevant on the question of financing, because this is the major topic on the burden/responsibility sharing. And I like to base the discussion on data and just give today's numbers from CIPRI, that is the Stockholm Institute that presents this approach. The total military expenditure at global level is $2,443 billion. We are talking about 10 times the Portuguese GDP. 37% are from the United States. NATO guarantees, without Sweden, 55% of the total defense spending, and $238 billion of sales come to the American economy again. So this is the way, and even, for example, the Secretary General, when was in visit at Washington, used, and I'm quote, NATO creates a market for defense sales. This is the way to approach, in this particular context of the electoral campaign, and then the political and diplomatic arenas should work on it. But I think really that it could change the dynamics, but there are structural ways of proceeding that are bigger than internal electoral processes. We have seen that in the previous Trump and Biden administration, and we are going to see it again.
Thank you. So last question before we go for the Q&A, and because we're only talking about challenges and maybe to end up something a bit more positive, I would ask you which opportunities would you see for the future of the alliance? Let's start with Major now.
Well, I do see a lot of opportunities for the future because interoperability, multi-domain operations, a technological change, of course, facing resilience, that's the kind of things that we are right now operating, and I think it's going to get deeper, wider, and much, much more effective in the future. We cannot afford to work with other allies without being completely interoperable. And this is a must, and this is getting better every day. So I see this opportunity of everyone going together in these new challenges that we have ahead, what you are doing for the future of NATO, as a huge opportunity for us to find stronger and much more effective alliance in air, in land, in sea, in space, and cyberspace. That's what we need, and I think that we are learning that. And this is the big opportunity. But also, and this is as important, for the first time, I think we are really having a whole-of-government approach, a comprehensive approach. We are looking not only in the military domain, we're talking about civil and military domain. We're talking about a hybrid, all-domain operations. We are seeing that it's important to have economic justice development because it's based on a rules-based order, because we are based in values of democracy, because we do believe that we need to have enhancement of the people, because we need to have resilience of the people and the structures. So I think this is a huge opportunity for us to deepen that relation as well, to help others to develop in both ways, not only in the military part, not only in the civilian part, but in a comprehensive, holistic approach of this.
Professor.
I will say that the major opportunity is science and defense, because we are talking about satellites that could help us on climate change and answering directly to natural resources and to help population. We are talking about maritime security that could help fishermen on coastal states. We are talking about, for example, treatment of water to be drinkable to many of the populations. We are talking about communications that will allow populations to be more close to areas of response. We are going to enter probably in an era with a lot of natural disasters in many. We just see on Qatar what can in a day change a hub of airplanes, companies, etc. And in one day, all the country stopped, and is a world that is a country that is very well prepared on the question of technology and economy. It's a financial hub, etc. So I think science and the golden standard, and I highlight this, that NATO has, it's an opportunity to put populations inside the alliance, but also outside, understanding why NATO is important and what can do, not only on defensive and this way of conflict and war, but also in many different areas, on the case of resilience, for example. Because that, I think, science is at war. EIA is changing war, is changing the way that we see many of these realities. And I think our major opportunity is, but again, I'm a political scientist, so it's science.
Well, thank you very, very much to both for sharing your views with us about this topic. And now we could open the floor for our audience. So I would please ask you to raise your hand and then say your name and state your question. Please. Yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity to be Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity to be here and to listen to these distinguished speakers, as well as the intervention by the Chief of Defense. And my name is Luís Valença Pinto. I'm a retired military. Currently, I'm the president of Eurodefense Portugal. But mostly, I'm a retired military. And in my days as a military, I served in NATO for 41 years, 5 of them in the military committee. And I love NATO, to be honest. And I am, by definition, not an optimistic person. But I don't think that today we have many guarantees to be optimistic. It's really a time when crystal balls are very difficult to read and to take advantage of them. And the same goes to tea leaves. We cannot take anything out of them. But to mention something that General M. Speech said at the beginning, recalling 1941. In 1941, Winston Churchill said to his fellow citizens that they were facing the darkest hour. Everything that you have said is true, and I'm particularly happy to see how much we are progressing in the field of security cooperative security, which is in fact the most fragile part of the concept 2022, and I've been writing and intervening about that since then. It's a very positive step, but really, if we don't succeed in integrating the East, the North, the Southeast, the South, and the South goes at least until the Sahel region, if we don't succeed in making our fellow partners and allies to understand the reality of the situation out there, and to understand how the Mediterranean Sea is nowadays a cemetery and a wall, so different from European and transatlantic values, we will perhaps fail. Because in fact, we are close to a darkest hour in NATO. And not only from this lack of cohesion, but also because we have the great difficulty of the possibility to anticipate the outcome of the United States elections. And the European parliamentary elections is not at all something minor. And another point, and I will finish now, I don't believe it is possible for NATO to succeed integrating all this without the cooperation with the European Union. And the same goes to the European Union. And I missed in your excellent interventions this linkage between European Union and NATO. In fact, supported by the reality that 23 states are members, simultaneously members of both organizations. Thank you very much.
Professor, would you like to comment?
Well, I think I was very clear when I say EU-NATO is one of the most politically difficult topics inside the alliance. And that I think says it all, because it's very obvious that EU-NATO cooperation is paramount, but if the states do not agree to pass from technical level to political level, if states, and not only one, have different perceptions about what NATO and EU can cooperate and can do, again, we are talking about coherence, we are talking about unity, we are talking about political decision that comes from allies with different societies and positions regarding Euro-Atlantic cooperation. On the South and this dark hour, on more global and broader approach, I could not agree more. My point is that I really don't know if NATO understands what is the consequences of talking to themselves. Because this is the point. And you can be on what position from political to military to civil society. If you if you are not open to hear what the other says and want to change a narrative, but you don't have a story to tell, or you do not want to change the way you give content to the narrative and change the story to tell, it's very difficult. So I think it's very evident, the numbers show NATO is very negatively perceived in the South. I do not use the concept global south, but in all south, from Latin America to Africa. And, but if it does not acknowledge that and wants to still do things in the same way, with the same discourse, without listening, understanding, and engaging, really, we are going to create expectations and do not deliver.
General.
If I just may, I will add a little bit of a positive note on NATO-EU. And that is because of the Ukraine war. You all heard about Ukraine Contact Defense Group. And the Ukraine Contact Defense Group is 54 countries. I've been in the majority of the meetings, as many people here have been, and never I heard so many times all sides of NATO and the EU talking together. And NATO is thanking EU, and EU is thanking NATO, and the United States is thanking EU, because there is a complementary work done towards Ukraine. And even when we had this crisis of not having the money coming from the US, it was EU that stepped up. So in this context, I think the practical reasons of the supporting the war of Ukraine helped a lot the relations between EU and NATO. And Ukraine Contact Defense Group is a very good example of this. 54 countries around the world are together every month discussing about what we are doing together in very different commissions and groups, what you can do best, integrating the efforts that are complementary because, as you know, EU is doing the economic part, and of course it's doing also the military part that NATO was not doing because it was not acceptable. As you know, you cannot do military aid directly. It has to be the nations. So this is a positive note. There has been a lot of divides in the past, but right now it united a lot the discourse inside NATO, inside EU, that EU-NATO cooperation is working fine and much better towards the effort for Ukraine.
Thank you. Please.
Hello, Patrick Singler-Later, President of the American Club of Lisbon. What do you think should be NATO's role and its relevance relative to two fundamental trends? Let's first look at the United States. Irrespective of who wins the election in November, there is a long-term trend in the United States which I think is irreversible. The US is more concerned with its relationship with China than any other subject, and will continue to be focused on that, I think, for at least the next decade or beyond. Second observation, and the same question, what should NATO's role, reaction, relevance be? If we look at the global south, we have powerful countries in an increasingly multilateral world who basically tell Europe, NATO, come on, Ukraine, it's your problem. We are not terribly concerned. Brazil, India, South Africa, other important countries are saying, this is not relevant to us anymore. So what should NATO's reaction be to these two fundamental trends?
Please.
Yeah. Well, I'm not a political science here, so I'll let Anna talk about that. But let me just add two things. One is, that is not new about China. If you see the trends for the last 20 years, maybe 25 years, that was the trend. United States have been much more concerned about China than it was with Russia. And it's only worried about Russia because of what Russia done in the last few years and not before. So I think this is a continuation. It is obvious that, of course, Pacific, that's the center of gravity for the future of the opportunities and, of course, the center of the attraction of the United States and China. And that doesn't affect that much what we think about NATO. It's obvious that the United States have Atlantic and has Pacific. So, and you have Quad, and you have AUKUS, and you have a lot of organizations that face that factor. So I don't see any big change on that. I just see a trending that continues. It will increase, probably because China is growing. It haven't stopped for the last 20 years. It's slowing a little bit, but it's still growing. The second thing is, why should they matter? And I go with, I would do some chorus with Ana Santos Pinto. We have to change the narrative. We have to engage southern part of the world. We, all of us. all of us, EU, NATO, and other countries, because we are not getting to the people. We are not explaining what is happening. This is not about only Ukraine. This is about the world rules order. Is that the world that you want to live in? Do we want to live a world that destroys completely the charter of the UN? Do you want to live in a world that we disrespect completely, that we allow that by force a country can invade others and take that by force? That is a Pandora box. If we allow that to happen, that will happen in the future for decades from now. So when I travel to many parts of the South that you're talking about, and of course there is a civil society and there is a political society, but the civil society that is informed, they do like to discuss that. The political society that rule, of course, they say, this is just turning my world, I don't have anything to get with that. But that is the same discussions we had in the past about Iraq and Afghanistan. It's their problem. It's not their problem, it's our problem. It's just a very small world. So the narrative has to change. We have to have a narrative. We have to go and face the challenges we have now in disinformation, in lack of cultural, in hearing the other, and making, of course, a close contact and partnerships. This is so important. Partnerships to the South, East, and West.
Well, I'm not only the political scientist, but I can tell what I think. I'm not institutional engaged, so it's much more, and I really like this, it's much more simple to put it. First, regarding China, I completely agree with the fact that we just are growing on attendance, although the United States made in the last 6 years they evolved to bring China inside of NATO. First with the concept of de-risking, and we both know that it's not possible to de-risk with China in the way that we did in the question of Russia with the gas, etc. It's not possible for the United States economy as it's not for the European economy. So we must be aware of the risks, but de-risking is something that I think it's a kind of mythological in the ways that our economies and mainly our industries work and our production work. But what I think is much more relevant in the context of the Atlantic Alliance is last strategic concept used the expression strategic competitor with China. And this is something that I still understand as not completely consensual in allies, in the coherence, because there are many allies with very different relations with China, and this idea of strategic competitor, even though the European Union uses a very similar but not exactly the same, it's very difficult, again, inside the EU also, to discuss China in these terms. But connecting this with the South, or this idea of broader South, for the broader South, there is no difference between the Atlantic Alliance and the United States. NATO is the military branch of the United States. And being NATO or being any other country will be the United States inside. So there is something that I think it's very important, because Euro-Atlantic societies and governments lost this narrative battle with do not acknowledge double standards. There is double standards. Now explain the double standards. And it not begin with Ukraine. It's previous, but it's much more used with the question of Ukraine for the South and in many contexts. What I think it's very structural and permanent in the international politics, it's that countries like Brazil, South Africa, India, Angola, many countries in this broader South are not going to accept lecturing about norms. And this is something that I do not know if NATO allies and European Union member states are ready to deal with. Because there is a lack that exists that Russia and China occupied, that is this rule-based order is double standard. So when we want to engage with partners, we need to take this into account. And China is doing that amazingly, and we are not doing, I think, what we can do to accommodate that.
Thank you. Perhaps a question from the back.
Thank you very much for your presentation. And my question is regarding the Middle East. The Middle East today is one of the greatest examples of how the artificial creation of states, especially after Sykes-Picot Agreement, increased chaos and disorder. My question is regarding how NATO interprets Iran asymmetrical strategy in this. Let me just. In this region, particularly after the Iraq-Iran war. Thank you very much.
Professor.
Well, I think that Iran is much more than a symmetrical war. Iran is nuclear proliferation. And I think NATO probably on the planning, but also on the political debate, we'll have to start this discussion with partners. And the Gulf, it's very, very clear. Iranian nuclear program is, this is my argument for a long time, the most important topic in the Middle East that changed everything in the last 20 years. And it's going to be that for a long time. So it's not only the question of asymmetric war, it's much more than that. It's dissuasion in the helping on the case of the nuclear program if it goes ahead in the next years, because it's going on Iran, it's going on Saudi Arabia, it's going on Turkey, it's going on Emirates, and keep going. So I think what NATO should engage with, it's about arms proliferation in the Middle East and considering the debate on non-proliferation in nuclear dimension, because that it's not going. We are not talking about 6 months or 1 year. We are talking in a long trend. And again, to my numbers, Saudi Arabia is the 5th most bigger expenditure in defense. And I think the case of the Middle East is something that NATO should be very worried about.
Well, you jumped 3 times in history. Sykes-Picot. If you talk about François Sykes and Georges Picot, if you talk about 1916, it is interesting because it's not about only the division of the Middle East, it's about what the rules-based order was then, that of course 2 or 3 countries could divide the parts of the world they wanted to, and that was possible, but the sense of betrayal, you know, when we see that the Lawrence of Arabia, and you see the sense of betrayal that was sensed by the Arabian people at that time, that of course they were very angry, and then of course the Balfour decision and all of that. But we cannot allow ourselves to jump in history and then talk about the Iran-Iraq war. That's 1979. And that of course it was the change of regime changing in Iran. That is a huge gap in history. And why am I telling this? Because it's very dangerous for us to do and jump in history for revisionism, to talk about present. And that is something right now that we have to be very careful about it. Because every time we look back in history, how long do I go? And how deep do I look to? And we have to be very aware of what we have the rules-based order right now. We have a United Nations Charter, we have the recognized nations, and they exist. Stop. Let's look at it as they are right now. Now, talking about Iran. Iran is exactly one of those problems that we have to face, not asymmetrically, but directly, because it's conventional and a nuclear threat. So it's nothing that we can just look away like it is a regional problem, because it is not, it's a world problem. And we have to face it as a community. And sometimes it's not about having the gaps of discussion is about having a united front, again, in a very open society where you have United Nations decisions, Council Members decisions, how it was operating before this new crisis that we had. If you go back 8-9 years ago, the international community was agreeing in the JCPOA agreement for Iran, and then everything went down. So right now, we have to go back to revise all of these agreements that we lost, because in the end, it's about not a regional power, but it's about a power that can affect the rest of the world, because it can become a nuclear threat to the rest of the world.
You are not being positive, no?
Huh?
You are not being positive.
I'm not being positive.
Or optimist.
Sorry.
Please.
Thank you very much. Thank you for excellent panel and presentations. And thank you very much also for the warm welcome to Finnish and Swedish membership to NATO. And here I wanted to underline that how appreciative we were for the very strong support that Portugal showed from the very beginning when we started the application processes. We really felt welcome as an applicant and as a member, so thank you so much. Finland is one of the latest members, Portugal is one of the founding members. What I wanted to ask you about is the significance of NATO membership for Portugal. What has the membership meant to you? What does it mean to you? And what are the most important sort of contributions of NATO membership to Portugal, like in terms of development of the armed forces or the politics and so forth? You talked, Director General, at the beginning of the sort of the importance of having this sense of belonging to group of allied, and I would imagine that that's one of the main issues also behind the strong support for the NATO membership in Portugal. But it's a wide question, but anything that comes to your mind would be very welcome. Thank you.
Well, let me start by this. Portugal has been a very credible, reliable, and honored NATO nation for the last 75 years. And because we came in NATO, we had a NATO generation. The majority of the armed forces, especially the officers of the armed forces of Navy, Army, and Air Force, grow up in NATO, with NATO values, with NATO comradeship, with NATO exercises. And of course, they had to travel inside NATO countries, and they learned about democracy, values, and all of that. And that made us more resilient and more knowledgeable for the world. And at the same time, when we started the missions in NATO, we always participated in the NATO missions without caveats. We go as south as people say to us. So we were in Kandahar or Helmand province in Afghanistan, or we were, of course, fighting in the worst conditions in Bosnia or Kosovo. It doesn't matter. We go without caveats. And this has been the credible and resilience of the NATO, the Portuguese NATO nation, that we like to show ourselves when we go shoulder to any ally, you know, from Spanish to Finnish to British to Americans. We go steadily with our credibility, because it's very, very, very intense for us, standardization. So when you have a Portuguese Navy frigate, is as good as any other frigate there. And you have an F-16 flying, it's as good as any other F-16 as a land battalion it is. So this level of proficiency, efficiency, credibility, and resilience in values, I think this is the best that happened to our, and we are very proud, after 75 years, to say that we are still here. We still want to be here, and we will be credible, reliable for the next 75 years.
Professor, would you like to add something?
Yes, besides this socialization and modernization that I think it's very important for the armed forces on the democratic period, I will add also on the foreign policy and the civil military dimension in Portugal. Because, as you know, Portugal as a founding member of the alliances before the EU, so the interlinkage between foreign policy, defense policy, civil and military areas inside the government, also engaged with NATO. And that was very important for the state apparatus, the administration, and being engaged in this civil and military, because NATO has the political diplomatic, from the Prime Minister to the Minister of Foreign Affairs, or NAC, and Defense Minister, and all the areas beside that, and also the military. So I think this was very important as an anchor to the modernization of state and to the Portuguese policies adapt in this democratic, rule of law, human rights way of doing things. I think it's very, very important for the Portuguese public policies.
Please.
Thank you. If I can just add a comment to your question. In 2022, in the Transatlantic Trends, which is a survey done by the German Marshall Fund of 14 countries, including the United States, Canada, and some 12 European countries, in which we have also Portugal. And one of the questions was about the degree of support for NATO. In Portugal's case, we saw that the degree was 90%. Of the Portuguese population supported NATO. So I think we really feel a sense of huge support for NATO. As Anna was saying, perhaps, of course, there is not also the necessary level of understanding of what NATO really is, but I think there is a general sense of belonging to a security organization, and that sense of belonging to an organization that has also a transatlantic link, and this connection with the United States and Canada, and of course with our other European partners, it's very important for us. I think really, in our case in Portugal, we really do have this transatlantic connection. For us, it's very important, and this sense of belonging to a wider transatlantic security cooperation. And as we can see, and we see it every year when we do these types of research, we see there's a very huge level of support from the Portuguese population.
Thank you. They're in the middle of the corridor.
Well, thank you very much for the very insightful discussions. My question is related to NATO summit expectations, more focused on the defense industry. So last year, the allies agreed on the Defense Production Action Plan, and this year there are discussions evolving on a potential defense industry investment pledge. So I would like to see your views on how these discussions are evolving. Are we ready for this commitment? How would this look like?
Professor.
Well, we have a new trust fund for industry. There are, because we have common financing in NATO, but the majority of the initiatives are based on trust funds and bilateral or states contributes in the case of defense industry. I think we are going to have a problem. And the problem is, if the European funds from the EU are based on an European production and probably with an agreement with the United Kingdom, and being the United States treated as third country, we are going to have a problem. Because one thing will be NATO and industries of allies, where the United States is, of course, overwhelming on production and on sales. And if we have financing that will allow a series of countries to achieve the 2% and increase the budget based on the criteria of common procurement and European industries, then it's going to be a shift to European industries. And I don't know how NATO is going to solve it. Anyway, there are undergoing discussions on industry, on the financing, on the criteria, on
the accelerator of data.
exactly, and industries are are looking very closely to that.
And NATO investment fund.
Exactly, that was the trust fund that I was relating is that the NATO Trust Fund, that is a private fund with contributions from a series of allies. Again, private fund in the model of the United States financial approach. And I think all that it's going to have a moment of more significant debate and possible tension when in the next legislature of the European Parliament and next Commission we talk seriously about European Union financing to defense industry.
General, would you like to add something?
No.
No? And our final question?
Hi, my name is Frank Missel. I'm just retired. But I have a comment on returning back to the comment about the Global South. I think that, the sort of Russia versus Ukraine is a very clear case where NATO is defending human rights, the rule of law, and so on. But I think the problem of everything that's happened in the Middle East since October 7th is really clouding the issue because, I mean, the global institutions have not been able to really make a difference in the Middle East and Gaza. And so this tremendous number of people being killed, I mean, it really causes a problem because how do you talk about human rights and rules-based order and all the rest if the institutions are unable to take a stronger stand in the Middle East with this clear problem?
Professor?
I completely agree with the idea that global multilateral institutions are very difficult response to this. And the rules-based order also has this kind of crisis because Security Council from United Nations is the main responsible for guarantee security and peace and is not able to guarantee the security and peace. But besides Middle East and besides Gaza, I would like to, for example, ask anyone in this room knows how many deaths Sudan has registered in the last months. And we are talking about hundreds of thousands of deaths in Sudan that has nothing to do with the Gaza war, and none of us in the news hear about it. And of course, people in Sudan, as in Yemen, as in Djibouti, as in many other areas, look to this and feel that international institutions are not answering, and mainly global powers, being Russia, United States, China, India, or wherever, engage with this. So I have a lot of problems with the Global South because Global South is a general category to put many, many different things inside and brings to light a great tension between India and China, who is the leader of the Global South. What is completely transversal is this idea of not being represented, not being seen for the global and great power arena, the great power conflict that we are again. I think there is only one way to solve this, is being represented in international institutions. It's really acknowledge that the world is not the world from the Cold War, is not the world from the 70s. It's different. Different on demography, different on economy, different on industry and production, different on expectations and communication. We have very different notion of time and space. So, or we are engaged with this idea, or we are not going to fulfill expectations and answering to problems as Sudan.
Just adding a little bit on this idea, if we think about the the advanced border of Europe, it is the Sahel. And if you think about that, it's not because we are fighting there, it's because we believe that security and development in this area affects all of us, including, of course, all of the people living there. And this is something that we have to take into knowledge when we're looking at Gaza and Israel and other places, when we look at the multilateralism of our systems, of our international rules-based order, that we really have to have a little bit of a stance to say, what is our role? Individual nations, all the nations, what can we do? We can reinforce our collective voice in some ways, but we cannot overthrow what is happening right now. Is if you freeze the United Nations Security Council, because it's very difficult to take decisions right now because the 5 permanent members rarely agree. If that is the case, now you have to find ways to be coherent in other arenas. And I think the example that many European countries are giving right now is trying to be coherent in their own set of voices, trying to get together in European, in multilateral, in NATO, and other alliances so we can have a common voice. Because if you go nation by nation, just issuing your own opinion like it was a buffet or a cafe, it's not going to happen. It's not going to help. So this is the time for us to join a little bit of forces together in these voices, because in the end it's all about the common values.
Thank you very much, General Lemos Pires, Professor Ana Santos Pinto, and thank you all for being here to FLAD, CPA, and I would just ask you to please do a round of applause for our speakers.
Jesus.
Olá,
Ai,
como está?
isto deve ter apitado.
Tudo bem. Alice,
Tenho